Drums, Girls, and Dangerous Pie, Chapter 6. No More Vacation. If you're like me, you wake up on a nice Saturday morning in the autumn and you want to smell the crisp fall air, sit halfway up, stretch, and then go back to sleep until about noon. But if you're like me on this particular Saturday morning, you also want to wake up so you can see your mom and brother when they get home. Somehow, at least half of me believed that my mom and Jeffrey would come hopping out of the car, run into the house, and share a good laugh with my dad and me about the little false alarm they had been through. You know, like, haha, those silly doctors. Can you believe they mistook a nosebleed for leukemia? It's just so ridiculous. And then I'd pout for a while about how my mom hadn't called me all week and tease Jeffrey about how chubby he was getting from all the cheesesteaks and soft pretzels down in Philly, and then go back to sleep for a nice, lazy Saturday nap. When my mom finally pulled into our driveway, though, I saw that Jeffrey was asleep in the back seat, and I started to get nervous. Jeffrey never, ever used to sleep on car rides. I am a big car ride sleeper, maybe the biggest. But Jeffrey was usually just blabbing away for hours on end on any kind of road trip. Once we drove to the Outer Banks for a vacation when Jeffrey was 3, and he stayed up until after midnight on the way down. At about 10 p.m., while he was giving me a lecture on the various rescue heroes and why a voice tech rescue hero is completely different from a body force rescue hero, my parents pulled off the highway into a Cracker Barrel restaurant and rented a Charlotte's Web book on tape to shut him up. But even then, he made my mom stop the tape every 15 minutes so he could ask long strings of questions. Have you ever tried to sleep while a pint-sized maniac is rattling off hundreds of detailed inquiries about the web-spinning mechanisms of the common barn spider? Granted, it was strangely amusing to watch the accountant and the English teacher attempt to explain arachnid biology. But overall, I was about ready to strap myself to the roof rack by the time Jeffrey finally nodded off, just in time for us to arrive at our rental house, so he could wake up again and ask a million new questions about the locale, the sleeping arrangements, which pajamas he should wear, and why Stephen always gets to sleep on the couch when all he gets is a stupid bed. Anyway, that's why a sleeping Jeffrey didn't strike me as a reassuring sign. My mom left him in the car and walked up to the door to hug us. When she took off her sunglasses, I couldn't believe how old and tired she looked. After my hug, she stepped back for a moment, and I made a pretty major social blunder. So, Mom, everything's okay, right? This whole cancer mistake is all sorted out? She looked at me like I had just asked her for a cigarette. Stephen, this is no time to joke. Your brother is a very, very sick boy. He is? I just figured it was all a big mistake. Mistake? Mistake? Well, you know, when you didn't call and all, I assumed. What do you mean when I didn't call? You know I spoke to your father every single night. Well, no, actually, Dad never. You didn't tell him that I called? Didn't you tell him anything? He at least knows about Jeffrey's condition, doesn't he? Honey, oh boy, there was something going on here for sure, but I wouldn't find out much about it right then because Jeffrey woke up right at that instant and knocked on the car window. My mom immediately jogged back out to him. My dad gave me a sheepish look and started off slowly after her. I could tell by the slouchy way he was walking that he didn't exactly relish the thought of arriving at the car and facing his angry wife and sick son. But on the other hand, he certainly couldn't just stay in the doorway because then he'd have to face me. I stayed inside while my dad made a big show of grabbing the bags from the trunk and my mom carried Jeffrey in. Jeffrey looked really beat too, although his black eyes had faded to yellow and his nose had gone back to normal. I was afraid of what I would say to him, but as usual, I was worried about the wrong thing. I should have been afraid of what he would say to me. He started right in, and although his voice was kind of gravelly, the words came out at lightning speed. Stephen, you should have seen it. The hospital was huge, and I had a real bed, and you could move it. The head sat up, and the feet did too, and the doctors came and put a needle in my back. And then I couldn't move for an hour. But Mommy got me a cool book about knights in shining armor. She sat on the floor and read it to me upside down so I wouldn't be bored. But I was anyway, and they gave me sleepy medicine and put a special tube in my chest called a catheter. And another time they put a needle all the way in my hip bone. It hurts. Then they took out some inside bone stuff called bone marrow, and my bone marrow is sick. So they put another needle in my back yesterday with the throw-up medicine, and I had a needle stuck in my chest for 5 days. He paused to look at my mom for confirmation. 5 days, right, Mommy? When he pushed up off her shoulder to look at her, I looked too. I couldn't believe it. She was crying silently. Her voice came out all trembly when she said, "Yes, baby, 5 days." I was standing there with my head reeling. My brother was really sick, so sick that they had to stick a needle in him to take out the marrow from his bones. He was so sick that they had to stab a needle into his spinal cord. He was so sick that my dad couldn't bear to tell me about it, and that my mom was instantly crying as soon as the details were mentioned. And everything I had been thinking all week was 100% wrong. My mom recovered enough to ask Jeffrey if he wanted a snack, but he turned kind of green and said he wasn't hungry. I found out later that he had begun chemotherapy for his disease, and that one of the many side effects was nausea. "Can you put me down? Can I hug Daddy?" "Of course, honey." "Daddy, I missed you." Despite my shock, I remember thinking, well, you didn't miss much this week, dad-wise. "And I missed you, Stephen. I thought you might be lonely without me, so I got you a souvenir." At this, Jeffrey pulled something out of his pocket. It was a box of orange Tic Tacs. I couldn't believe it. In the middle of this horrible experience, Jeffrey had thought of me and had even managed to find me a box of my favorite candy. I thanked him, and I really meant it, which wasn't always the case when I showed gratitude to Jeffrey. I remember when he was maybe a year old, Jeffrey went through a phase of picking up random objects from the floor and giving them to one of us, usually me. I'd be right in the middle of building a gigantic Lego space station or whatever, and he would come toddling over and present me with that month's copy of Better Homes and Garden, or the TV remote, or a used tissue. And my mom would make me stop what I was doing and say thank you. I hated it at the time, and my annoyance had blinded me to just how generous my little brother really was. Okay, before this turns into some kind of weepy love fest, I will tell you what happened next. I took out the Tic Tacs, popped one into my mouth, and offered one to Jeffrey. He held out his hand, pinched the Tic Tac between his thumb and pointer finger, flipped it into his mouth, and promptly threw up onto my sneakers. My first reaction was to shout, "Jeffrey, Mom!" Jeffrey looked up at me with the hurt little deer eyes he gets when I yell at him, and ran to the bathroom. Mom told me not to move, got a white plastic kitchen garbage bag, made me step onto it, and then took my sneakers off of me as I stepped off of the bag. My dad was just kind of staring at everything with a baffled expression until my mother told him to go after Jeffrey. Then she turned back to me and told me to stay still, even though I was dying to take off my favorite sweatpants, which now had gore-spattered cuffs. She was dialing her cell phone at top speed, which I couldn't figure out until she started talking into it. "Hello, this is Mrs. Alper, Jeffrey Alper's mother. He's a patient in clinical trial number 366. They told me to call if he..." "Okay, I'll hold." "Mom, what's going on? Why do you have to call?" "Is this the nurse?" "Okay, Jeffrey left there 2 hours ago and he just vomited. What should we do?" I was thinking a quicker cleanup might be a great place to start, but nobody was asking me for guidance here. In fact, my mom was leaning way down by the garbage bag, examining the vomit, and any interruption of this bizarre task seemed unwise. No, there's no blood in it. Well, my older son gave him a Tic Tac, orange. Do we have to adjust his meds? Yes? And you'll fax the adjustments to Dr. Puro here? I should call him in about an hour? Okay, thanks. She hung up and turned to me. Stephen, we have to be really careful with what Jeffrey eats for a while. As I took off my sweatpants and my mom started in on my sneakers with some paper towels and a can of carpet cleaner, I muttered, "Now you tell me." My mom stopped, looked up at me, laughed a little, and surprised me with a quick hug. I missed you, Stephen. I missed you too, Mom. Now go tell your brother you're not mad at him, okay? And I realized I actually wasn't mad at him. All in all, this had been quite the morning for surprises. I went into the bathroom, threw my socks in the hamper. They looked clean, but just in case. And put my arms around Jeffrey. My dad was there sitting on the closed toilet seat, trying to be comforting, but he really hadn't gotten his bearings yet with this cancer situation. I think he was relieved when Jeffrey leaned right into me. I started my old trusty, "Hush, Jeffy," chant, and my dad tiptoed out. And after a while, Jeffrey calmed down. I looked right into his huge blue eyes and said, "Jeffy, it's okay. I'm not mad at you for throwing up on my shoes. Can you do me a favor next time, though?" "What?" "Please aim for my dress shoes. I hate them." Okay, Stephen. Now let's brush the taste out of your mouth and go, I don't know, how about a drum lesson? Yay, drum lesson! We went down to the basement. Jeffrey banged around on my drum set for 20 minutes or so, and things felt normal again, for a little while. Then Jeffrey told me he wanted to take a nap, which he hadn't done for at least 6 months. I figured he was probably tired after the week he'd had, so I took him up. Mom and Dad were clearly having a very intense discussion in the dining room, so we just went right past them to his room. He wanted to wear his PJs, so I got them out for him. He took off his shirt and pants, which left him standing there in his Star Wars Episode 1 underwear. As I handed over the pajamas, I saw that his lower back had a fairly massive bruise on it from the bone marrow aspiration, although I didn't know the name of the procedure yet. When he put the shirt over his head, I got a quick glimpse of bruising along his spine, too. I didn't say anything about the bruises, though. I read him 2 chapters of The Trumpet of the Swan, tucked him in with his stuffed animal pet dog, cleverly named Dog, by the way, and walked downstairs to the dining room. I was somewhat sure I wanted to know what was going on with my little brother. When I walked into the room, my parents were both clearly agitated. They both jumped in at once, my mom trying to tell me how she had called every night, and my dad trying to explain why he hadn't told me. I shocked myself by telling them I didn't care about any of that they should just give me the medical report on Jeffrey. So they did. Jeffrey had been diagnosed with ALL, which stands for acute lymphoblastic leukemia, a form of blood cancer in which certain types of white blood cells become deformed and multiply rapidly. Because the deformed cells, which are called blasts, don't do the jobs they're supposed to do, and because they can compete with the good kinds of blood cells for survival, the disease is 100% fatal if it isn't treated. The reason why his nosebleed had been so bad is that the leukemia had drastically reduced the number of platelets in Jeffrey's blood so that it wasn't clotting normally. That was also why he was bruising so easily. When he had first arrived in Philly, the doctors had run a huge battery of tests to determine how bad Jeffrey's cancer was, whether it had spread to other systems in his body, and how likely he was to recover. Things weren't as ugly as they could have been. The cancer hadn't gone to other systems, but they weren't great either. My baby brother had what they considered a moderate risk case. That meant the odds of his surviving this were over 50%, but not by much, which meant that his chances of dying were under 50%, but again, not by much. No wonder my mom was weepy and my dad was a zombie. We talked a little more about things like scheduling. My mom and Jeffrey would be in Philadelphia at least 2 days a week for the first month of treatment, and how to handle telling people. It turned out that my mom's parents already knew, and so did a lot of extended family members. The reason nobody had called the house about it yet was that my mom had asked that nobody call or visit until she and Jeffrey were home. My mom's principal knew, and so did some of her closest friends, but most of her school didn't know. I didn't know what my dad had said or not said at work, but from his general level of communication that week, I had a feeling he had been clamped up pretty tight with everyone. On the other hand, his coworkers would have to be blind and deaf not to have noticed the sudden changes in what was now passing for his personality. Jeffrey's school would have to know, of course. My mom had another thought too. And what about your school, Stephen? Would you like me to call your school counselor? We could have a conference call with your teachers. Or you could just shoot me now and get it over with. Stephen, it makes perfect sense to alert the school staff to a situation where one of the students might need additional support. What additional support? A group hug in homeroom every morning? Maybe my teachers could write you little notes in my agenda book. Or how about you sign me up for a nice counseling group? Perhaps you could make me look like more of a dork to my peers. Do you think you could get me a seat on the short bus? What has gotten into you, Stephen? I'm trying to help you here. The doctors told me that siblings of... She kind of had to swallow before she could get to this next part. Cancer patients find the experience very stressful and... Stressful? Stressful. Why should this be stressful? Just because my mom and brother disappear for a week and nobody tells me anything, and then they come back and my brother is barfing right and left with bruises all over him. And he can't even stay awake, and his little back is all... Then I busted out crying, which I'm sure was a great comfort to everyone. At least it shut me up for a while. My mom put her arms around me, and we stayed like that so long that my neck was getting a crick in it. Now, normally, I'm not the biggest fan of being hugged by my mother in broad daylight at this point in my adolescent years. But I must say, it felt pretty nice right then. When I finally pulled away a bit, I looked at my mom and pleaded, "Please don't call my school, I'm fine." Yeah, teenage boys who are fine always cry on their mother's shoulders until they leave a snot trail. Okay, Stephen, for now we won't call. So they didn't call, and if any of my mom's friends told their kids, it didn't get back to me for those first few weeks. As for me, I was always the perfect big brother for Jeffrey, the silent microwave oven mate that my dad seemed to want, and completely sarcastic and horrible to my mom. Don't ask me why I dumped everything on her, but I did. Meanwhile, at school, I still kept plowing along, practicing drums, writing journals, completely bagging all my homework assignments, and faking human interaction with the people around me. Inside my head, though, I had a whole new activity: bargaining.